Let's go. So d4, d5, knight f3, c5, a sort of principal move. If your opponent plays the move knight to f3 on move 2, okay, no problem. Pawn to c4, a very good counter move, basically keeping it in Queen's Gambit territory. And the smoke cleared a little bit. This move, the structure goes a little bit toward a Queen's Gambit accepted. So of course, there's Queen's Gambit decline variations, like for example, e6 would be the Tarrasch variation. All right, so this would be the Tarrasch defense of the Queen's Gambit decline. And this would be like, let's say, the symmetrical variation if we play the move knight f6. But again, I'd advise not to play something like that. Okay, so pawn takes c4 goes back into, I would say, Queen's Gambit accepted territory. And, well, let's see what happens. The smoke clears, and we have what appears to be a pretty dull position at the start. And it remains sort of dull. Okay, so you look at this position and you go, well, not much is going on, and each side can play logically. I mean, the kings cannot castle anymore, but rooks can still come to the middle. Pieces are still developed. Okay, it's an endgame / middle game. No queens on the board. Queenless middle game, let's say. King e7 I like a lot, because sometimes you need to keep the king in the center if there is an endgame coming soon. So I like the move king e7. It allows the rooks to be connected, but keeps the king in the center. So this is actually pretty common in these type of positions, keeping the king in the center and preparing for a mass trading down the D and C files. Okay, so let's think about this. So we've got two open files, which both sides can really challenge. And so probably what's going to end up happening is a lot of trading. So keeping the king in the center versus, let's say, castling and having your king further away probably won't do you a service if this becomes an endgame. Okay, and so we'll sort of see what happens. So king e7, king to e2, trying to connect the rooks. I think that king to e2 makes some sense, because you want to connect your rooks, but you don't want to put your king on one of those open files, right? So king c2 connects the rooks and gets out of this pin, but then you have to look at things like rook to c8 happening, where your king might be caught in the crossfire on the c file. So you got to be a little bit careful. So king e2 makes sense, and I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of this position. That's not really the goal of this lecture. I want to try to focus on the main points. So both sides do sort of logical things. They're trading pieces off. You know, it made sense for Rubinstein to trade this bishop for this bishop, because this one is controlling all of the center dark squares, controlling the position pretty nicely. And, well, so trading those off and using the fact that this knight is in a pin makes a lot of sense. So that's what happened. And the game, again, clarifies itself a little bit after some trading. So, okay. Now, what do you guys think of this type of position? I'm going to stop right about here. Okay. What do you guys think about this position? So I know I sort of swiftly went through the opening moves, but I would say that a lot of different things could have happened there, and nothing was really decided in the opening. It was a pretty dull opening, I have to say. So finally, we get to a situation where we need to look at what's going on, who you may rather be in this position, you know, and so forth. So let's have a look. So I'm reading the chat. Some people say it looks about equal to me, which I think is fair. French expert says it might be equal, but I'd rather have black. Black has the better pawn structure on the spectrum, says. I would prefer black. The bishop is better than the knight, and white has more advanced pawns. Okay, I'm not sure I agree with that. .mycom says, I think black wins. White has inferior pawn structure. Dimple Pinch likes the knight. So yeah, I would say that if you had to pick a side here, I think you want black, but you just like mainly because of the pawn structure. I don't actually think that the pawn structure is detrimental. It shouldn't actually be the losing position, but I would rather be black here because black has actually no weaknesses. You know, the knight versus the bishop, it's arguable which one is better in this position. In general, it is an open board, so the bishop seems pretty good in general. But the thing is, when you have pawn structure damage, you have to remember that the bishop is locked on its color squares. So when you have one bishop, that's certainly not as powerful as two, right? If you had two bishops, like let's say there was a bishop here and then black had a bishop here, I would take white all day. But with one bishop versus the knight, I think I like black here, just practically speaking. I like the better pawn structure, and some people had mentioned that these pawns are advanced, but that might actually hurt white right at this present time, because the further advanced the pawns are, the more weaknesses they leave behind that can't be controlled. But I believe that the position, I would agree with most of you that the position is about equal, but I still would rather play black here with a healthier and more flexible pawn structure. Okay, so rook to c8, and that move's logical because you're controlling the open file and you're trying to infiltrate, trying to find some action on the open file. Okay, both kings are sort of poised for battle, so I think that both is perfectly fine. And here is where something happens that I don't want you to do, which is why I said that this game was really easy first. And the game itself, the reason I didn't spend a lot of time on the opening, is a pretty dull game. But there's something to really be taken away from this game after what happens. Okay? So, black played knight c4 check. And I would say that, I mean, knowing my audience, and I have been doing this since March on our channel, so I've got a pretty good feel of our audience at this time. I would say, knowing our audience, I probably know that a lot of people would be quite impulsive in this position. So you immediately sort of go, boom, give me that knight, and I can't have you probing my position like this. So get out of my house. The thing about impulsive decisions where you just trade to trade is you have to realize that every trade you make in this position as white gets you closer and closer to an endgame where you would be suffering. So white committed really the ultimate sin here back to back. Okay? White should have played king to e1 or something like this. Okay? I understand why he didn't want to, because he doesn't want to leave this knight here, which could be reinforced by a pawn, obstructing the position, tying down the rook to the defense of this pawn. So fine, he took, right? But then here was the final straw for white. What shouldn't white do here? Which is what white did. That's the key. What did white do here, which he should not have done? Yes, that's exactly right. All of you are right. Ergash is right. Elbas is right. Everyone is right. You guys know how to find the moves of what not to do. So that's a start. Yep. Rook to c1. That is a huge decision. A huge decision, which was such a bad decision for a lot of different reasons. And I wanted to show you this because it really follows a lot of rules in chess that are good to know. So when you have an inferior pawn structure, trading further into endgames is usually not what you want to do. Because the worse your pawn structure is, the harder it is to gain that counterplay without pieces, right? So if you have a pawn structure like this, there's a lot of things I don't like about white's pawn structure. I don't like this, I don't like these as much, and I certainly don't like these pawns in a king and pawn endgame that much, because they're, by advancing them, they're actually exposed to a quicker attack by the black king. Okay? The real part I don't like about this, though, is these. I don't like the pawn structure damage on the king's side. And white did indeed commit the trade of rooks, which forces him into a totally lost position, which is not the easiest to win. So it's still beautiful to see how Rubinstein carries out the whole process. But I'd like to just show you what happened. But I would say, again, I mean, this is really supposed to be a informative lecture, but also just sort of engaging and fun. So I don't dwell too much on small moves, but this is a big move, right? Because what you're saying is, I'm trading off my last source of counterplay, and I am firmly confident that I'm going to not lose this endgame. But why would you be confident that you can't lose this endgame? Why? Because the pawns are even? You clearly have the short end of the stick. You've got these fractured kingside pawns over here. And, you clearly have the short end of the stick. Why would you trade your last source of counterplay, your last rook here? So, of course, Rubinstein trades, and he goes straight into this endgame. Now, I have a rule in chess which is a little controversial, but only to people who don't know how to play chess. And that rule is that you don't trade when you're up. Okay, so you don't trade when you're up. Don't trade ever, basically, except when you're being attacked, you're allowed to trade, and you're allowed to trade when you know you have some sort of theoretically won endgame, or you can liquidate and you've calculated that you've won the endgame. If you are unsure that by trading you're going to either, like in this case, you're going to draw the position or you're going to win the position, don't trade. Keep your chances alive. Practically speaking, you'll always have chances with the pieces on the board. Okay? But if this is a lost endgame and you didn't realize that prior to trading, because you were like, oh, whatever, even pawns, like what, should never have traded in the first place. If your ability is beyond understanding that this is a lost position, then don't trade your rook, right? So let's say most of my audience is 12 or 1300 rated, mean, average, okay? So you may not be able, you might just think, oh, after rook to c1, yeah, I've got this fractured pawn structure, but I think I can hold it, but you're not sure that you can hold it. Then don't trade rooks. Don't trade rooks, because that eliminates your last chance to hold the position, which would be to keep your source of power on the board. So, okay, rook c1. Now let's talk about how do you win. Okay? So one thing that's powerful in the endgame is basically you try to envision where you want your pieces to be, and then you see if it's practical to do that, like if it's realistic to do that. So you guys can type it in the chat. I won't play the moves, but where do you think you want the black king here? Realistically, you can't just say, well, I want it here, because white is gonna stop you from going there. So be realistic. Where do you want your king? Okay, and then we'll try to achieve that. Okay, so rough ride, French expert, Verdigris, Shaktas, AK Grandmaster, all say the move h3. We want our king on h3 attacking the weakness on h2. Very well. Some people say on the queen side, my only beef with you getting the king here or here is that white is ready to meet you on the queen side, because white's king is also close to the queen side, so you might not actually be able to get there. d5 and e5, that would be standard to put your king in the center, but the thing about that is white can get there pretty quickly too. So like you go here, I go here, you go here, I go here, and we're sort of having a standoff in the center of the board. So I agree that on average, you do want your king in the center. But in this very specific endgame, you want your king here. So let's see how that works, because you're attacking this weak pawn. So let's say you go here, 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 here. So you can actually get to h3 before he can stop you from going there. And then, so the question would be, if you do that, which is exactly what Rubinstein did, this does two things. All this was forced, by the way, and I'll tell you why. Okay? So, when this king comes over here, if the white king doesn't start running over here right now, black is going to win this pawn for free, and he's just going to have an unstoppable pass pawn. These two pawns cannot create a pass pawn against these two, and by the time the king makes it all the way down here to gobble them up, forget about it. The game is over, because this one will be promoting. So all this is more or less forced, because white's got to guard that pawn, and black went down there to attack it. So that's, let's say, step number one, which was get your king to where you want it to be. I'm always a huge fan in these type of endgames, or in most endgames and most chess positions, to keep your pawns flexible, unless you can really like neutralize a group of pawns. Like the one thing that I'm looking at here, if I'm playing the black pieces, is the move pawn to b5. And why am I looking at that? Because I take away both pawn moves from white's queen side with one move, right? If I go the move b5, I freeze these pawns, and I stop this one from moving. So basically what I'm doing is, with one pawn, I'm stopping the movement of two pawns, right? So that's, I eliminate all the tension and everything like that. So Spicy Indian Swag says, can't white shuffle the king, boom, 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 boom? Well, that's what Cohn did. So we're going to see how masterfully Rubinstein conducts this endgame with very, very, very great precision. Okay? So let's check out what happens. So first, Rubinstein plays the move e5, which I like a lot. I mean, to be honest, I like this move too. Right? I don't think there's anything wrong with the move b5, because you still have a tempo to burn with your a pawn. You completely freeze these pawns, so white is going to run out of tempo. And you still have maximum flexibility. Thanks, Rup, for the sub. You still have maximum flexibility with these pawns. You could move them 1 or 2 squares depending on your tempo. Okay, depending on where you want to have. So, okay. So he played e5. That doesn't hurt the position. King h1. Finally, the move b5. I really like the move b5. I think that neutralizing these two pawns with one pawn just has to be the correct move. And I think it could have been played on the last move as well. Okay, but it's all winning. So the king shuffles back and forth. Now, my question for you is, what's the best case scenario here for black? So Kali asks a good question. He says, do you think he calculated or just used principles? In this case, I think he used principles. Here's what he did, Kali, which you can't always do, but in endgames you can do more often than in middle games. So he goes, do. He's thinking. He's like, where do I want my king? Oh, I want my king on h3. Okay, so when I get my king to h3, what's my plan then? Oh, I can create a pawn break. Oh, this, and this. Okay, so basically the way he does it is he sort of envisions where the pieces are going to be and then what he wants from the position. And so I think that up to this point, Rubinstein played all on feel, and then finally he figured it out by calculation. So he goes f5, because you can't actually win without creating a passed pawn, because we already know white is just going to keep moving from the corner back to g1 to the corner back to g1. That's all that white can do. White can't leave this pawn because white doesn't have any source of counterplay. So king h1, g5, king g1, h5. So now he's got. Here's what I'd like for you to remember. You see how this one pawn is dominating these two? That means that if Rubinstein needs an extra tempo somewhere as he's pushing these pawns, he can always go here. If he ever wants to pass the move on to white, he can always play the move pawn to a6. So he can do everything he wants to do. And then if he's like, oh shoot, I misplayed the pawn count over here, he can always go here to pass the move back over to white, which is why it's so important to maintain pawn flexibility in the endgame. It's so important because you never know when you're going to need that tempo. Here, Rubinstein just has that in his pocket. Even though he's brilliant, and he figured it all out anyway, he knows that he always has the move a6 to burn if he needs to pass over the move. So king h1, g4, here we go. This is the winning plan that Rubinstein carried through. Pawn e4, and I don't actually know what to suggest here because the plan is pretty simple. I know you don't believe me, but it's pretty simple. If you trade here, basically here's what Rubinstein wants to do. He wants to go here, and he wants to go here. And then when all the trades occur, he wants to have the opposition and then just use his king infiltration to round up all of these pawns. So for example, you'll see it happen in the game. But let's say that Cohn after g4 would have taken this pawn. So Rubinstein basically just wants to commit this breakthrough. And when that all happens, the king finally has infiltration elsewhere, and because the king has gained all the space and is closer to the pawns, black wins the game. So that's the plan. And there's nothing that white can really do about this plan because white can't move really. He can only move the king back and forth. So after the move g4, e4 was played. Rubinstein took, which also wins. He played the move h4, and again, this pawn break is coming in to open the position up, and what are you going to have? You're going to have this black king that's all in white's Kool-Aid, and there's nothing that white can do about it because he had to babysit his little dwarf pawn for the whole game. So then he lost. So he's going to lose this game. So, yeah. So this is what happened. This is the actual game. And here, Cohn resigned. Because, well, basically, what do? If you capture, I take, and this pawn is a goner. And once you lose that pawn, you're going to lose these as well. Basically, it's the case of the active king. My king is all in your position. Your king was stuck the whole time. And after some liquidation, boom, I win. Because my king is further advanced than you. So this was really great, and I would say that this was one of the most simple endgames, that I'm going to show you today, which is saying something. It's not that simple, right? But I would say that if we take it back, the lesson to be learned. So a lot of times people ask the players, do you remember some game, right? Like, do you remember this game, Winter Capablanca, or Rotlewi Rubinstein, or whatever, right? Like all these famous games. And they go like, well, oh, thank you, Fidel Corrales, for rating with 19 participants. I greatly appreciate that. Welcome. We're just doing a lecture on Rubinstein today. This is the Tuesday lecture, Legends of the Past. So we've got a good group of people who want to learn some chess, and we try to give a little bit of history and some good content. So anyway, players ask, like, does this person remember move by move, like every game ever played ever? No, they don't remember the moves from start to finish. Like, oh yeah, Rotlewi Rubinstein, d4, d5, c4, e7. Like, they remember bits and pieces. They remember the important parts of the games that they see. So every game of note, every game of the past has something that you're supposed to take away from it, which is why it's a famous game, right? So my goal with you guys is when we go through these lectures, I don't want you to feel like you guys have to memorize things, right? I don't want you to go and say, oh, I've got Carlsen can recite this position from some game from 1936. Carlsen, well, I don't want to speak for Carlsen, but most people who can recite games don't remember the games move by move. They just remember the theme or the concept that was supposed to be taken away from those games, right? So if my goal to you is every time I show you a game, we do a little recap about what I want you to walk away with. And if you forget the names of the players and you don't ever remember, that's fine. But I want you to walk away from remembering a few things about this game. Okay, so the biggest thing that you can apply to all your games forever and ever and ever is when you have an inferior pawn structure, don't trade down. You're setting yourself up for failure. Don't trade down unless you're absolutely sure you can draw the game. Here, when Cohn played rook c1, that was a death wish. He traded down into a losing endgame that he didn't even realize was losing. But my point to you is, this guy was pretty good for the time, Erich Cohn, right? He was one of these players that I see games played against all the time. But to me, this is such an elementary mistake where, see, Rubinstein may be able to win this endgame if Cohn doesn't trade rooks, right? But I would play something like f4. The idea is to stop rook h4, keep the pieces on, and never trade the rooks, and just try to use my rook as an active source of counterplay. I don't want to trade in. But when he traded into this endgame, he didn't have the vision to see that this was losing. He put faith that this would be a draw because the only serious weakness he has is on h2, and he thought he can bring his king over here and just guard it. But like I said, if you're not 100% sure you're going to defend that, and you're just a sitting duck with no counterplay, and let me tell you, this position is an example of a sitting duck. When your only moves are to go here, 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 just back and forth the whole game, that's what we call a sitting duck. Okay? When you see that coming, if you're not 100% sure you're going to draw that position, don't play that position. Okay? He played that position. I don't know why. Because clearly, when you're in this position, there's something went wrong. So why would you willingly go into it? And so the rest was history. Well, basically, it was a matter of trading the pawns to get the opposition to break through the position, and then you just have a king that's ready to just completely pounce on the position, right? So, like, I don't want to say terrible game. I mean, I don't like to, everyone is prone to making errors. To me, however, it seems like the move rook to c1 is an error that basically no strong player now would ever do, because it's like, ooh, I've got a nasty pawn structure. I certainly don't want to go into a king and pawn endgame. In fact, this philosophy could have even been taken back a move. Knight to c4, I'm not trading my bishop either. I'm keeping all pieces on the board. I'm just keeping all my pieces. To me, this would make it harder for black to win the game. But taking is okay. I would not have done it myself. But rook c1 is, don't do that. If you trade into an endgame where you have the inferior position and no counterplay, that would be, that would not be good. So Yuri asks, what would happen in the second scenario if white won't take the pawn, but rather create a passed pawn? But how, Yuri? Like in this position, or do you mean that instead of guarding the pawn, white should just try to come up here and take, at the very end, f4 instead of f takes g3? Let's see. So we get here, this all happened. So where? Is it this the position, Yuri? So take a bit further. Here. Oh, f4 here. Oh, here, to create the outside e. Yeah, this spells trouble, though, because these two connected passed pawns for black, right? So takes, and these two connected passed pawns are gonna run home. So pawn to e6, pawn to f2, and then the issue here is that when you promote, it's all gonna be with check. So here, and g2 could also be played first with the idea of king h2. And basically, I promote just one step ahead of you because I get it with check. But yes, thank you for asking that, Yuri. Good question. And Grandmaster Naroditsky, who's hanging out in the lecture as well, even gives you props for that one as well. So M Wizard says you could even play king to g4 and go for mate. Yeah, probably true as well. Yep. Okay. So this was a great game by Rubinstein, and this isn't even close to his best game. There's a Capablanca game where Capablanca's playing white, and black has double pawns here, and he does the same thing. He brings his king to a6, and maybe he stole that one. Maybe he stole that one from Rubinstein. Okay, but Rubinstein is a great endgame aficionado. Okay, so yeah, every game was classical back here, Andre Cat, because, well, basically they couldn't turn the hourglass over fast enough to play blitz. Hi, I'm Peter Giannatos, founder of the Charlotte Chess Center. Subscribe or you might miss Checkmate in 1, your next game.